think?
That will be good. Thanks.
All right. The session is now being recorded, so I am going to start. Thank you very much for... Well, that's a good way to start a presentation, with a fire alarm, which is not a fire alarm. So it gives me great pleasure to present this topic on interviewing in sensitive communities. And it is based on our research that we have done, and these are my co-authors that I'd like to acknowledge, Prof. Castellane, Prof. Haynes, and Dr. Utet. We had, as a result of our research, published an article in a high-impact journal titled "A Reflexive Lens on Preparing and Conducting Semi-Structured Interviews with Academic Colleagues." And this is what prompted this presentation in terms of sensitive communities. It was also a publication that was written with the intention of really guiding researchers and pulling through the threads of many different components of conducting interviews into one article to serve as a reference for future researchers. We have, as a result of this, also presented it at an American university to the Qualitative Forum because of the usefulness in that information. I also would like to acknowledge, because it takes a village to raise a child, and it takes a village to complete research as well, Prof. De Wit and Dr. Tanya Ralph van der Merwe from the Wits University in their contributions to the study, and also just to acknowledge Prof. Kitty Ace, whose support and encouragement is just, it doesn't know boundaries. So I'd really like to acknowledge Kitty in that as well. So this is what I'm going to do in my presentation. I'm going to unpack the term sensitive, look at a definition of sensitive communities. Dempsey et al. Has published a framework for interviewing in sensitive communities, and I'll discuss that a little bit. I'm going to share our research context, our experiences, and then end with some concluding remarks and take-home messages. I never end a class without the students having to have at least 5 take-home messages before I let the class go. So what is sensitive? And I had a look at dictionary definitions, wandered around the research publications and that, and had a look at the Cambridge Online definition. And sensitive, and the underline is because it's copied from them, and I have referenced it, means easily upset by things people say or do, or causing people to be upset, embarrassed, or angry. It is about understanding what other people need and being helpful and kind to them. It is about people being easily influenced, changed, or damaged, especially by a physical activity or effect. And it is about a sensitive subject or situation, etc., that needs to be dealt with carefully in order to avoid upsetting people. And this, to me, really didn't fit what we're talking about in terms of sensitive communities, because it's being fearful of what people think and fearful of upsetting other people. So this really, in my mind, wasn't a very useful definition. When you go and you have a look at the research and you try and you do a data search, you find topics on sensitive interviewing, sensitive research, and sensitive topics. And interwoven in these 3 different things are the terms outsider, insider, and fluidity in terms of researcher positionality. None of the publications that I read really adequately defined what is a sensitive community. And for me, a sensitive community implies, in terms of research, that it's a vulnerable community. But at the same time, that community may not know this. they may not recognize the fact that they are vulnerable. It is a sensitive community is about a small community. And as soon as the community is small, it increases the possibility of identification indirectly, despite strict measures, through biographical data such as age, gender, place of work, position of authority or not in authority. And again, the community may not recognize this. And I remember a number of years ago at our university getting a request to participate in a breast cancer study, which I was very happy to do because I would like to have shared my voice. And one of the first things that the researchers wanted was to identify your department that you worked in, your age, your qualifications, and your position in the department. And by default, my position and my name would be known to the researchers, and I pulled out of that research simply because of that reason. So even our staff at that particular point is known as a sensitive community. There may be issues or concerns about trust in sensitive communities. It might also mean that in a sensitive community, the researcher occupies a dual role of both researcher and participant. And I know that a lot of researchers always say, but you cannot be a researcher and a participant in the same study. But there are a number of publications, and many more recently, about the dual role that the researcher occupies as both a researcher and a participant. In sensitive communities, there are a lot of opportunities for ethical dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas as a result of power imbalances, as a result of relationship difficulties, because you're known in the community or not known in the community, and their friendship relationships, etc. It's about the autonomy of the participants as well. So when we talk about a sensitive community, it's not only about the trauma or the marginalization or violence or displacement. There are a number of other factors that can be taken into consideration. Dempsey et al. Developed a framework for what they called sensitive interviewing, but at the same time, in their publication, they also addressed sensitive communities. And it's an incredibly nice publication, and I would urge you to have a look at it. It's in my reference list as well. And the authors give, in a table format, what should be considered throughout the research process and what actions can be taken, and they provide lots of practical actions on how you either mitigate or consider that particular action. And it is across qualitative interviews, and in my opinion, we can use that in multiple places. Sorry, it takes a while for the slide to upload. So they give 7 different areas of consideration. The first one being preparation, planning, and implementing the interview schedule. So concerns with methodology and piloting. There were a number of other aspects as well. Then how one accesses the vulnerable group. Who are the gatekeepers? What role does the gatekeepers play? How does one communicate both with the gatekeepers and how does one communicate with the sensitive community? Then it is about the time and location of the interviews. And the authors speak a lot about flexibility of the location and the time of the interviews, and that it should be more suitable for the participants. And this really got me thinking, because we as researchers often select the venue and the time for the participant. We might cover their travel and accommodation costs to get to the particular location, because perhaps it suits the researcher more than the participant. The recent research coming out seems to suggest it would be better that where possible, and of course we must look at that the participant plays a role in selecting the time and the location. Very much about rapport and relationship building. It's about building the relationship with the participant. They speak about care for the participant and about effective listening. So listening and hearing properly. The authors speak about therapeutic interviewing, particularly in sensitive communities. And it is a strange term. Sorry, I'm just listening.
Please do not evacuate the building just in case. I repeat, do not evacuate the building just in case. Thank you.
My apologies, again, a second interruption. It's not an evacuation. But the therapeutic interviewing means that the interview is done well. I'm not sure why they use the term therapeutic, but the authors speak about know the questions well, listen adequately, and remember to provide refreshments for your participants. Concluding the interview and addressing reflexivity, debriefing and bracketing, and then of course the ethical considerations. So I had a look at this framework, and what I'm going to do now is to discuss how and what we did in our research. So the first aspect that I'd like to describe to you is our research context, because that will help understand why I'm seeing this as a sensitive community. South Africa has 8 higher education institutions, each of them offering training in occupational therapy. Each program usually only has vocational rehabilitation as a curriculum theme, and in that university, there's one educator or coordinator who is responsible for the vocational rehabilitation curriculum theme. So you've got 8 lecturers in this particular area. At one of these universities, I am the educator in this particular theme. There's no established curriculum for vocational rehabilitation, and the research that I did was to establish a framework for the first professional degree in vocational rehabilitation. Just giving a moment for the slide to come through. So hence the interviewing conundrum that I sat with in terms of perplexity. Our colleagues are in a small, somewhat connected community. We know of some, we know some better than the other. Because of this small community, anonymity was absolutely key. By default, it's very easy to let both the institution be known or the participant be known. So that vulnerability. Professional relationships had to be preserved in this research. So one had to navigate those intricacies very carefully. Again, I am a researcher and potential participant. I am, in terms of my positionality, both an insider and an outsider. I know my field, vocational rehabilitation, but I'm an outsider to most of the other universities, but an insider towards the curriculum theme. And there were really no research publications that could guide me in navigating the intricacies within this community. A qualitative approach was very much indicated. However, in looking at curriculum development, and I'm sure each of you in your own departments know that curriculum development in health sciences is not well established. There are a number of articles about curriculums and curriculum framework, but there is insufficient information on how you develop curriculums within health sciences and how you evaluate them as well. So the numbers in terms of the research that I was doing wasn't important because the community was small. We had only 8 people. The research had to be contextual and authentic, and each voice of the participants was equally important. There had to be openness, and we had to explore the how, the why, and to understand the curriculum development within each higher education institution. And we had to focus on the educators' perspectives. We used an occupation-focused or occupation-centered model to help us understand the perplexity of this community. It's referred to as the person-environment occupation model developed by Law a number of years ago. So in this research, you sit with a person, with their background, their experiences, and what they are doing. In terms of the environment, they work within a higher education institution where they have their own mission and vision and focus areas of the institution, and that particular person performs an occupation of a lecturer. So they are both a clinician, they are a researcher, and they are a teacher. And the research was to blend and co-construct the reality of the curriculum in vocational rehabilitation, but at the same time to manage the power perceptions of the different participants in the research. Our experiences of this within the sensitive community, because there are only 8 people involved, is that it's not a sequential number of steps, and it's a process of blending, moving backwards and moving forwards. The first important aspect for us as researchers within this community was to make our positionality as, well, particularly for me as the collector of the data, to make my positionality as a researcher known and to make it overt. And I attempted to do this in this particular diagram. So at the bottom, you can see the research was conducted in 4 phases. The first phase focusing on the curriculum, the second phase on the educators. So this is where the interviews were conducted. The third phase was on the graduates and their experiences, and the fourth phase was putting it all together. So the first thing I had to do is to look at my researcher identities. Who am I? Sorry, this alarm is being tested again. My researcher identities, or my identities within this research program, was that of an occupational therapy educator, because I had worked at 2 different higher education institutions. As an occupational therapy clinician, I had worked in private practice, in public health, in a homeless center. I had worked in private practice as well. So I had numerous different kinds of experiences across the spectrum of vocational rehabilitation. My identity, because of my experience and my years of experience, made me also a mentor and a researcher. My positionality, and sorry, I'm going to come back to positionality. I first want to look at the subjective eyes. And if any of you have the time to have a look and to read through Pershkin, there's also a recent publication, they say very clearly when you look at your positionality, your subjective eyes is what you wear as a cloak on you the whole time. It really defines who you are. And people who know me will say very clearly, I am an ethical eye. I am a disability rights advocate. I am a carer. I know I am a carer. And I am an advocate for a number of things. So that subjective eyes you wear on yourself, and you have to recognize that. My positionality was like an undulating wave through the different phases, and drawing in my identities, drawing in my subjective eyes. So at times I was very strongly an insider, depicted by a solid line, but at the same time there was also an element of outsiderness, where at the end of the research, both the insider and outsider was blended, and you had almost a bit of a hybrid position, but the fluidity of the positionality moved through the research. And one's positionality had to be declared to the participants, that they knew where you were coming from. Positionality and positionality influences reflexivity, which contributes towards the research credibility. So that was really important, was to know what the positionality, what my positionality was and how it influenced the research. And I must say that was really a very enlightening process to establish that. And then from the positionality, one had to develop and prepare the interview schedules, which are important for trustworthiness. So how we did that is we went to the literature. We looked at 2 main areas of information, from the context of curriculum development and from the content of vocational rehabilitation. So we really scrummaged and scrutinized the literature to see what we could pick up and what we could put into our interviews. We developed 2 formats for the interview schedules, and I'm I must say that Prof. Haynes really guided me in terms of that there was a format for the researcher that had the main question and the probing questions, and then there was a format for the participant which just had the main question, so it didn't have any probes on that. And we could prepare the participants for what was happening during the interview. Again, it was something when we conducted the research that was not often done. At the same time, we also developed a field note format. Oh gosh, my presentation has just left. Sorry, I'm not sure what has happened there. I'm going to have to upload it again. My apologies. Back up again. Piloting and going back. We also developed a field note format that I could fill in directly after the interviews, what had happened on site. So it was in a table format, what had happened, and then my reflexive moments. Why had it happened? What could I do differently? What were the reasons? How could I carry this into the future? So there were a number of questions that I went through. Then from the developing the interview schedules was piloting the interview schedules. And I know there's a lot, many feel that there is no need to pilot an interview, to pilot your interview schedules, but I have really learned the value of this. And we did it in 2 phases. The first phase was theoretical piloting. I had 2 curriculum experts scrutinize the interview, and then 2 occupational therapy clinicians who were also part-time lecturers. So I couldn't ask any of the lecturers in vocational rehabilitation to scrutinize the interview schedule, but I could ask 2 part-time clinicians. And we had a meeting afterwards, and we worked on made the necessary corrections. Then I did the piloting, the practical piloting. And it just so happened that one of my colleagues had resigned from one of the higher education institutions, was working at a different institution, but not in the same field. So she met absolutely all of the inclusion criteria, and I did the whole interview with her as a participant, every aspect of it, from the consent forms right through to the conclusion, and then what I did afterwards as well. And it was enormously valuable. I was incredibly anxious during the interview. You are interviewing a colleague, an academic colleague that you know you need to protect the identity of this person and the institution, but it's also a colleague who has equal or more experience than myself. So it really, I was very, very nervous and very hesitant to go into it. And what my colleague said to me afterwards, you've got to slow down. You are too fast. You're not giving me an opportunity to speak, and you're not hearing what I'm saying. Don't stick to the sequence of the interview schedule, because sometimes the discussion goes off in a different tangent, and then you can come back to your interview schedule. So it was fabulous to have done this pilot study because it really helped. It gave me the confidence, and it also helped to troubleshoot. Then ethical attentiveness. And is this not just a beautiful word, ethical attentiveness? Because it means that you're attentive the whole time. It's not only adherence and it's not only consideration. So it needs to be meticulous and it needs to be constant. Hagen and Gilliman in 2012 speak about ethical mindfulness. It occupies you the whole time and it becomes your research compass. So you're thinking of your participant, you're thinking of the context and what is happening and why is it happening. There are 5 features of ethical mindfulness. It means firstly that you acknowledge ethically mindful moments together, and you do that in terms of a researcher journal. So sometimes there were things when I was afraid of anonymity, or I was afraid of breaching different aspects related to the ethics, and the participant wasn't necessarily aware of it. So what were those moments? Why were they happening? How did you handle that? It also means attending to discomfort, because when there's discomfort, there could be an ethical dilemma. Usually a sense of discomfort implies ethical dilemmas, both from the researcher and the participant. In your being ethically mindful, one articulates what's at stake. Be open and honest, especially in terms of confidentiality, anonymity. And when we went back and looked at the transcripts, there were moments in that interview that I had to say to the participant that that type of information was perhaps not necessary for the interview, and did they want to include it in the transcript? There were a number of issues that came up not related to the curriculum. Then reflexivity, to practice reflexivity through field notes, sharing, pondering, and bracketing afterwards. And then I want to say to researchers, please have courage. Courage to be authentic and to do the right thing and to be honest. And that's also being part of being part of ethical mindfulness, is to have the courage. And I think this research showed me there were a number of instances where I didn't have a publication. I didn't have research to guide me, and one had to move forward. So how did I apply this? In terms of respect and doing no harm, I had to protect the academic integrity and confidentiality, both on a personal, professional, and institutional level, and that came out in the transcripts. I went through an incredibly rigorous process of allocating pseudonyms to the participants. The participants also named many people in the interview, and I allocated initials, not identifiable initials. I allocated numbers to the higher education institutions randomly, and then to the hospitals and the clinics they mentioned, I also included a pseudonym to them. And I had to be careful that those references were across all 8 transcripts, but also within the transcripts. It wasn't only the name of the person, so that in using quotations or aspects of the interview, that information would not disclose who the person was or the institution. My approach to the interviews was mutual learning and equal participation. Although I was the researcher, we had a conversation. We were 2 colleagues, that there would be comfort, there would be respect for an academic colleague, and then I had to negate the power balances between the researcher and the participant. And my reflexivity and ethical attentiveness was interwoven. So the first instance where I noticed that perhaps the power differentials that I thought I had managed were not, was part of my gaining access and initiating the research. So I got ethical clearance, I got consent and permission through the gatekeepers, which were the heads of department, and sometimes the institution wanted further clarity. And then the educator gave me consent to continue with the research. The process took 8 months because it was highly complex. And then the first phase, was to request the study guides, because that was part of my document analysis. And the educators were not forthcoming. And it was at that point that I realized power was definitely at play for various reasons. And what I did at that point is I built in an extra measure. And this is part of the next step, is managing your power perceptions. I thought about it and I wondered, are they scared? Are they hesitant? Is it because of where I work and my university? Are they perhaps afraid because of other problems within the particular higher education institution? So what I did is I built in a greet, meet and share. At the participants' higher education institutions, I physically went to each university and each participant in a non-recorded interview and went through the consent forms again. We shared our positionality and our identities with one another, and we established a relationship, because that's important for the interview. So there was mutual respect and understanding, and we could dispel misunderstandings about one another. That greet, meet, and share relationship had an equilibrating effect on the power imbalances. As soon as we went through these sessions, the documents were provided, there was no hesitation in moving through the interviews, and this was done before COVID. We had to do it face-to-face and on-site. It also made me aware of the institutional culture, because sometimes the institutional culture can play a role as well. Because I was on-site in the department, I was aware of what was at play. During these interviews, there was appropriate reciprocal sharing. I got a feel of the environment, and then we spoke about the venue and the time selection. Now, we know that that can also be associated with perceptions of power, and there's research about that. And there's also research to say that it is the researcher's responsibility to make those necessary arrangements. But in my interview practicalities, the venue, the date, and the time was selected by the participants. It made it much easier to have a look at their program, and I bent over backwards to make sure that I could meet the suggestions that they had made. My only proviso was that I set the longer appointments. It takes longer to set it up. It takes longer to unwind and to get everything together, and you have to have a little bit of play. It wasn't a scheduled 90-minute interview. And that worked really well because I wasn't rushing off. The participants weren't rushing off. Part of interviewing is to prepare the participant. And that was that they had those interview schedules beforehand. And the participants afterwards said that was very valuable. Some of them prepared, some of them didn't. It didn't matter, but that they knew what was coming and they felt comfortable with it. One also had to manage the potential for researcher fatigue. The interviews take a lot of time and a lot of energy, and you're managing a lot of things in and outside of the interview. So one must be sure that you're not fatigued. I also did, and I know that many of my students do too, I packed a researcher kit for absolutely all eventualities. Refreshments, water in sealed bottles, light packet of snacks or dried fruit, something easy to eat with, that I didn't have to use an oven or something else, but sometimes you were over a lunchtime or over a tea time. Extra batteries, extension cords if necessary, and a please do not disturb sign, because one forgets about the please do not disturb sign. I didn't want to scramble for things when the interview was going, so I had a multitude of stationery, etc. And then, again, there's very little written about it. How does one look? What do you wear when you're conducting research? Because formal clothing can also create distance and a sense of power. And what we decided was a neutral professional appearance. And I kind of wore more or less the same colors and sometimes the same types of clothing to the different interviews. So my makeup, my jewelry, etc., did not interfere. It wasn't a problem. And when I presented this information at this American university, all the researchers said that they do consider that very carefully, but it's never been written up. And we included it in our article. You had to know that interview schedule really well, because you can deviate from the sequence. You can adapt depending on how the interview flows. So you've got to know it well, know where you're going to, know your probes, and then do not break or stop the interview at all possible. So don't stop for refreshments. And we were really good at doing that. In terms of the interview, I'm almost hesitant to say it's an interview, especially when one is working with a sensitive community, is to facilitate a flexible conversation, not necessarily collegial. In my instance, it was. So that you have a conversation about the topic. There's trust and rapport. There's a comfortable conversation. It is structured and focused, where our questions and probes helped. And as I said, I think one needs to memorize them. The semi-structured interviews gives one the flexibility in terms of the sequence of the questions and the conversation. One needed to engage fully at the moment and acknowledge and be aware of eye contact, body language, and the words used during the conversation, non-judgmental, and unexpectedly during the interviews, and I'm not sure why I'm saying unexpectedly, but it was, there was often sharing beyond the boundaries of the interview. One of my participants said that the interview, the conversation was completely cathartic for different reasons, to another participant who really used the opportunity to discuss things in the interview that she wanted to, it related to a curriculum, but was not part of my analysis. I couldn't stop the flow of the interview, but I had to work through it. So it was unexpected. And there was also one of the interviews where I really had to mediate the ethical eye in the interview, because I was aware of plagiarism. And it affected the work that I had done previously, and I had to not step into that trap of being judgmental or saying something about it which went against my ethical eye. But because I was aware of my positionality, my identity and my ethical eyes, I knew that that was not the place to be ethical at that moment. And that is these ethically mindful moments that you record in your research diary, and that the interviews end positively. Post-interview, allow time for conversation, small talk, which is not recorded. That's the unwinding disengagement. What I did after the interviews, I visited the facilities. If the participant invited me, I did. I left it in her hands. I gave them a very small token of appreciation made by people with disabilities at a protective workshop. It was a pencil, and it was a little pamphlet from the organization, which the participants really valued. And again, they say you don't give gifts, but to me it was a token of acknowledgement for their time and their input. It really didn't cost anything, and it was made by people with disabilities. I sat immediately and I made my field notes and my reflections, either in a car or a coffee shop close by, downloaded my data and protected it, ensuring data integrity. Again, had a look at my field notes and my reflections, and then there was time out to disengage completely as a researcher. Then thereafter to go through the transcriptions. There were 32 hours of transcriptions, which was a lot. And I remembered on the next day to email the participant and send gratitude and telling them about the next steps. So my concluding remarks on this is that one plans one time and plans for more time than one thinks. Undoubtedly, the piloting of the interview, all aspects thereof, is incredibly invaluable. That the research must be conducted in an appropriate setting. It might not be according to the theory and the publications, but it is what works. It's having that courage to do what feels right. To be mindful of and reveal one's positionality and the fluidity thereof, and be open. It also depends on the type of community that you're engaging with. To have a conversation in the format of a semi-structured interview, to prepare the participant adequately, all of them in the same way, to have a research support team, because it's about care for the researcher as well, particularly in sensitive communities, and then just to prepare and prepare again and prepare again. Preparation is essential. What are my take-home messages for this, for myself and perhaps for other researchers? It is crucial to examine researcher positionality. It is imperative in sensitive communities, and it gives one a multidimensional lens through which one views the data, analyzes and interprets the data. One has to know your context, especially in sensitive communities, and one might conduct research in a sensitive community as an outsider. So we research in sensitive communities, but we should be sensitive researchers as well. We are the research tool. One must value and respect and acknowledge one's participant. and then to engage in reflective practice. And perhaps that is a topic for one of our discussions as well, because it really balances subjectivity and objectivity, as well as balancing involvement and detachment. The interview should be conversational and not, in my opinion, in this context, and perhaps it depends on the different communities, not a pure research interview. It is a research interview, but a conversation elicits rich information. Be aware of one's presentation, the voice that you use, the words that one uses, as well as the nonverbals. Be acutely aware of one's role as a researcher and the associated responsibilities, because one remains the researcher, and then remember to disengage. And I think my final comment on this is, in qualitative research, are all communities not perhaps sensitive? And then at the same time to look at, are we sensitive enough as researchers to recognize this? I have included a number of slides with my references. If you would like to go back and have a look at that, I'd really urge you to have a look at the article by Dempsey. It is incredibly valuable. And without blowing our own whistles, I think the article which we compiled, in which we pulled through all of these different components, can perhaps also serve as a valuable asset for future researchers. And it is now 1:45, so we have a moment for conversation or for comments, if any. Tanya?
Yes, I want to say thank you, Tanya, for presenting such a nice presentation on the work we've done. I just want to emphasize we underestimate our role as supervisors in preparing students to do qualitative research, specifically when they go and collect the data. You've got one opportunity, and that opportunity you must use. In quantitative data, we speak about the rigor of the tool and what's the reliability and the validity. But in qualitative, we ignore that. And we should recognize the important role of the researcher or the student when she goes and collects data. That is the tool. So preparing that student, having these reflective conversations, what are you going to wear, and whatever Tanya said today, and having sort of practice on yourself, and then doing the pilot interviewing, debriefing on that, how did it go, how will you do it different, and then sort of looking at each of the interviews and seeing what can we do better in the next one. I think we underestimate that role as supervisor. Thank you very much, Tanya. What a good presentation.
Thanks, Prof. Haynes. And I just want to again acknowledge, although you were not a supervisor in this process, your incredible role as both my personal mentor, my research mentor in this, because this is something that you strongly encouraged me to do and were part of the support team. And using your advice and what we did in this research, I've implemented that with my students as well, because it's so important. And you're saying we've got but a moment in time to collect the data, and the data needs to be valuable. Is to prepare the student adequately for that as supervisor, and then for us as researchers is to prepare our participants as well. So I want to again acknowledge you and to thank you for your huge contribution in this. Thanks, Prof. Haynes. Prof. Steenkamp, I can see you in the venue as well, and you have raised your hand.
Thank you very much. Yes, I must apologize. I joined a little bit late, but I want to say fascinating talk, Tanya. Thank you so much for this. And I actually want to ask something else, but I first want to agree with what other Tanya has said. You know, it's really difficult, and I wonder how many people really prepare their students well enough for qualitative research. First of all, you know, a lot of these things are not skills that you're going to pick up very easily. So you really need a talk about it to actually bring the aspects that need attention to the forefront. Like as you said, the debriefing, the clothes, the preparation, that type of thing, because otherwise it could really affect your research. But getting back to you, I would just for out of interest's sake, first of all, is the clothing. What color clothing did you wear?
Prof. Steenkamp, thank you for those comments. And this is one of the reasons why we wrote this article, which was published, because it draws together those things that we're not aware of. My clothing, I wore beige and creams, low profile jewelry. I wore, and I'm not a trouser person. I really embrace my femininity and like to wear dresses. But because I didn't know where I was going to be sitting at all times, and I didn't want to be worrying about a hem length or a skirt or shoes that had heels. So flats, creams, neutrals, trousers, and very aware of my neckline. And that was one of the problems with the research, that sometimes I sat on a stool with my notes perched on my knees because there was no table in the lecturer's office. Sometimes I sat in a boardroom, but I never felt uncomfortable in myself because I knew what I wear, I could cope with anything, even if there was wind. And then, of course, with the visit to the facilities, I was afraid that if perhaps I was drawn into a clinical department and one of the universities had a fabulous skills lab outside, it was windy on that day, that I wouldn't feel uncomfortable. So that is what I wore, and what the other institution also said to me they encourage their students to wear is the same thing: trousers, closed shoes, neutral clothing.
Yes, like what you'd expect them to wear in the hospital anyway, that type of thing. Because why I'm telling you is there's such a lot on the color of clothes and what that translates to somebody, I mean, as domineering or, that type of thing, all professional. So that was just interesting for me to know. I thought you might go with blue, in the health, blue and white. But yeah, so I think that is it comes across soft. Those are also very important things. I think, as you mentioned, the next thing I also wanted to mention is, your final comment on that slide, that are all communities not sensitive? And I would reply to that, and that really makes one think. I think some communities are more sensitive than other. And, depending also on the question that you're going to be asking, can also be, for some groups, what can I say? A bit of, difficult to answer or something like that. And we must also, have a look at how this is then answered, or how they look upon it, or if they frown upon a question, some groups, or not. And that can also sometimes maybe bring in a bit of a problem with qualitative research. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely agree with you in terms of sensitivity. My group didn't actually sort of acknowledge the fact that they could be vulnerable, but did as we progressed through the research phase. I think if we look at gender violence, or perhaps discussing rape or HIV, which are very sensitive topics within a sensitive community, knowing your community well, knowing your context, that building rapport and understanding beforehand, that you've got a level of trust and understanding before you pop in. And pop in, I don't want to use that, I don't mean it lightly at all, but before you start establishing or understanding the phenomenon that you are researching. But I think if one goes in cold, you're expecting a participant to bare their soul on something that's so important to somebody that they don't know. So perhaps even if one is an outsider, what strategies can one use to bring one perhaps a little bit closer, that we can build on rapport and trust, and then do the research interview? I think one would get richer data. But in my experience, because we've got time frames, etc., you jump and you do that interview. Personally, I think it's wrong. But I suppose each community is different. It's again about preparation.
Yes, Tanya, can I add another thing? It feels like I'm taking over here, but I promise you this will be my last thing. The one thing I'm thinking about is actually also working quite closely with something like a transformation committee with a interview like that, and also the phrasing of the questions.
Yes.
Are you, that's going to be very important. Like what we say also with the when we translate it, that you need to use a translator. Would that not actually be beneficial to also circumvent possible problems? Because you will have a variety of people from different groups, etc., on such a committee, and that would also maybe be really good advice to somebody.
Yeah. So that theoretical and practical piloting, that's where we can also pick that up. Because if you did theoretical piloting and you perhaps asked a member of the community to help you with the wording and the types of questions, besides the practical piloting, would also contribute towards that. So I do think that piloting phase of any research is really important. And in most qualitative research, people say, but you don't need to pilot. I feel you do, because how do you know what you're trying to ask is correct, will get the right answers, and is acceptable towards the participant? Prof. Haynes, you have your hand raised. I'm sure you want to respond.
Yes, I think if you look at QREC, the reporting guidelines, one actually needs to do a pilot interview. It's part of the reporting guidelines. But the other thing I want to say is we're currently looking at a human trafficking sort of study. And what we found very valuable, I mean, we are still in the proposal phase, looking at who's the stakeholders and what. But we've actually posed how to gain access and the questions we're going to ask is the participants. We've asked that to a big stakeholder, and you know how they valued that and helped us. So, Prof. Steenkamp, I 100% agree with you on that. It's very important.
That collaboration and knowing that context, knowing that community. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very valuable comments.
No, Tanya, I can just say to you again, thank you so much. This has really given me a lot of input into that as well. And, things that you can think of that you just take for granted. You think, oh, well, I'm not going to tread on somebody's toes. I'm not going to do this wrong, because you don't have the ill intentions, but naturally we never do. But the thing is, the actual hard preparation it takes and the difficulty of teaching.
Thank you very much. Jermaine, you have your hand raised?
Yes, thank you so much for an absolutely brilliant presentation. In qualitative research textbooks and articles, all these sort of, I'd call it the theory or the foundation of what we should be doing as qualitative researchers is out there. But what I love what you've done is you sort of brought it all together, shown that sort of intersection between the rigor, the reflexivity in your data collection, and the ethical overlaps that one needs to look at. And you've just put it in such a clear way that it almost kind of gives one I would say, dare say it, almost a roadmap to follow. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much for those words. And that was the intention of our article. So we hope it will help you as researchers and your students.
Sorry, lastly, Tanya, I'd just like to confirm that this will be put up on Eddie, hey? For the faculty to see, please.
I think so, yes. That is the intention. That's why it's being recorded.
Yes, yeah, please. I think this is absolutely excellent. And, even if we send out a notice afterwards that people please should go and look at the recording if they're doing this type of research to gain insight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Are there any more comments or can we conclude the session? And I am going to conclude. I want to thank you for your for being here and for your valuable comments and suggestions. And I hope this is a first step in perhaps many other steps of looking at how we can guide and supervise practically in qualitative research. Thank you very much, everybody, and wishing you a good afternoon further. I'm going to stop the recording.